Today we have a very exciting panel to start off the morning. The title of the panel is Analysis of Rhetoric in Crisis Leadership as Seen Through C-SPAN. So we have two great papers on this panel. I'm happy to introduce our first speaker and their paper title. This paper title is titled Disaster Management in Transition, Exploring the Communicative Discourse of Disaster-Related Initiatives, Policies, and Consequences as Captured in C-SPAN Archives. Our author and speaker is Brett Robertson from the University of South Carolina. Please help me welcome our first speaker and paper. Thank you very much.
I'm really excited to be here today to talk a little bit about my research and how I use the C-SPAN archives to answer some of what I think are important questions of our times today. Now, I'm going to start off with just a little bit of an exercise here, and I'm going to present a series of items. And I want you to ask yourself, be introspective here of whether or not you have this item at home, prepared, and ready to go if a disaster were to strike today. So let's start with number one. Who has extra water at home? Raise your hand if you have extra water at home ready to go in the event of a disaster. Okay, I only see like 3 hands. Now, FEMA and the Red Cross recommend having at least 72 hours worth of water per each individual in your household. So I only saw 3 hands for this item. Let's see how we fare on item number 2. Non-perishable canned goods. And let's make sure they're not expired either. Okay? Non-perishable canned goods. Who has a stockpile of some canned goods that they could eat if there's no electricity, can't use your electric stovetop? Nobody has any canned goods? I would think more people have some canned goods. Come on, y'all.
It's that expired part.
Yeah, that's the caveat there. How about a battery-powered radio? Who has a battery-powered radio? Okay, a lot more hands went up. That's a good sign. I think we should all give battery-powered radios as stocking stuffers at Christmas. That's what I'm doing this year. A working flashlight with extra batteries. How about that? Because you never know what the batteries are going to die or run out on you. And then finally, a fully stocked first aid kit. Okay, just a few hands went up. I would say as a whole at this conference, we need to do a better job individually of inspiring disaster preparedness. And one of the recommendations according to FEMA and the American Red Cross is that every household should have an emergency supply kit ready to go. Now, I do. If you were to travel with me, if you were to come to my house or take a road trip with me, you'd see I have all of these items in the trunk of my car, ready to go. Now, if you didn't raise your hand at all, you are not alone. In fact, recent estimates say that only 25% of American households have all of the necessary emergency supplies. And actually, with disasters increasing due to the effects of climate change, taking the emphasis off natural disasters and man-made disasters and just thinking about the global impact of how disasters form, create, and cause impacts in society, we're actually expected to see a rise in disasters over the years to come. In 2020 alone, there were over 400 natural disasters worldwide. Now, on the left side of the screen is the city where I live, Columbia, South Carolina. And in South Carolina, we get a ton of different types of severe weather events, whether it's the impact of hurricanes, severe flooding, and even harsh storms. We even had snow for the first time in like 5 years, and that was a disaster for some folks who didn't know how to drive through it. I know some of you are more well-versed in that anyway. So why is it important to potentially look at disaster communication through the C-SPAN archives? Well, I'll talk a little bit about why I wanted to, but I think there are so many different ways that policymakers come together to talk about disasters, but there's also a really big disconnect here. And looking at calls and associated funding efforts makes sense because national and global estimates state that we're going to be experiencing a lot more disasters in the future. And disasters also create grand challenges for infrastructure and also are considered a part of other policies like climate change, access to clean water, environmental protections and justice, food security or insecurity, and energy. So looking at how discursive framing of disaster management through the C-SPAN archives will help us situate how disaster management is prioritized or not, spoiler alert, in some of the contexts that I'll be discussing today. Most government agencies, including FEMA, are struggling to better understand the relationship between what is actually done in practice and what people say they want to do. Typically, when we think about disasters and we look at kind of the disaster management life cycle, it's a temporal process. We often put the emphasis on disaster response. When something strikes, that's kind of our typical crisis communication model there. And then we think about recovery. But a lot of scholars will argue it's just as important to think about preparedness itself, because preparedness involves looking at how we deal with the real or anticipated problems of a natural disaster. And broadly speaking, the objectives of disaster preparedness include being able to enhance the ability of individuals and organizations to respond when disasters occur. And it usually begins with some sort of analysis of vulnerability, in which stakeholders attempt to anticipate the problems that will likely occur if a disaster were to strike their home, their neighborhood, their community. And so the primary goal of disaster preparedness as compared to phases like recovery and response is to develop appropriate strategies in advance and being able to anticipate them before a disaster occurs. I'm not sure if folks have read or watched recently the new Apple TV series 5 Days at Memorial. Has anyone watched or seen that? It's a great television series, a miniseries that just came out that details how hospitals responded to Hurricane Katrina. And there's a wonderful scene, well, it's not wonderful, but it gave me chills when someone was opening an incident command book and trying to figure out the protocol for evacuation when flooding happened at Memorial Medical Center in New Orleans. And the incident command person couldn't find such protocol that existed. So there are really, I think, grand challenges to preparedness that sometimes just a binder or a book is not enough. We need real access to funding and really to inspire people to want to prepare on their own. Now, FEMA did a really big analysis in 2017. This was right around after Hurricane Harvey in Houston, Texas. They sat down and really looked at lessons learned. And I'll be using that phrase a couple times throughout the presentation because FEMA wanted to better understand the ongoing challenges to the preparedness stage. And this includes being able to inspire individuals to prepare for emergencies on their own, but also to look at capacity and coordination of responders when disaster events strike so that people can be implemented into the process early on. But yet, despite our own concerted efforts in scholarship, like the work that I do, but also in practice, we're still seeing just a disconnect about how we can move the needle to get people to prepare. So, I believe very clearly that disaster management should be prioritized by policymakers who have decisions to distribute funds to a variety of different types of communities that may not be able to be served in the way that they could. That's my own personal research agenda, or one goal of my research is to learn about that. And I think the C-SPAN archives are really just a wonderful way to learn about how legislators, policymakers, those who have potential to make change can do so. So I posed 2 research questions for this study. I wanted to know first and foremost whether or not policymakers prioritize preparedness, recovery, or response. And I also wanted to know, how do policymakers instill a culture of preparedness in anticipation for what's to come? I think by exploring these types of conversations, we're able to see the transitional gaps that may be apparent when looking at one phase or another, and how one phase may not be as prioritized. So using the C-SPAN API, which I found it very fun today to watch the video earlier about waiting for videotapes to come in and looking at the transcripts, because I was so impressed with how the technology has evolved that allowed me to conduct this project. So using the C-SPAN API, I conducted a keyword search using the terms disaster preparedness or disaster response, disaster recovery, and disaster management. And I included them from 2013 present. I started at 2013 because that was around the time of the Hurricane Sandy Recovery Reform Act, which was a very big deal for FEMA in implementing how we talk about disasters more broadly. And Hurricane Sandy caused huge amounts of human suffering and loss in those communities. And so FEMA considers this kind of a landmark piece of legislation that really encapsulates how disasters are talked about and how we can allocate proper funds to them. So the initial text corpus came up with almost 2,200 transcripts from 2013 onward. And so I was able to narrow that down a little bit by removing all of the unidentified speakers, and I strictly wanted to focus on policymakers here. And I focus on policymakers broadly, and I kind of define policymakers broadly in my paper: anybody who has potential to make change or provide input to legislators or legislation about disasters. That's kind of a broad umbrella definition, but doing that filter search allowed me to only use about 564 mentions of these terms. And from there, I had access to the transcripts. I engaged in open coding and coded a second round with the same research questions in mind to answer them. And I have some themes that I'm going to showcase here that hopefully illustrate what I've done through this project. So what do policymakers prioritize? It's a complicated answer. And it's probably not one that we can just say one phase or another, because preparedness is often only thought of as important after a disaster strikes. And we see that time and time again. And we also see that repeated measures of previous disasters serve as precedent. And time again, you will see mentions of Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Rita, Hurricane Sandy. These past disasters really provide previous experience for policymakers to start and initiate conversations about disasters. It's also rather complicated because disasters are intertangled with other policy-related issues. So while preparedness may not be as prioritized as we'd like it to be, it's because it's intertwined or intertangled with, let's say, climate change or food insecurity, for example. So I'm going to showcase just a couple of examples. I would have included the video clips, but for the sake of time, I just have the small transcript excerpts from some of these passages that I'm going to display here. And I've highlighted in bold some of the elements that I think we want to focus on. So what do policymakers prioritize? I'll just read the parts in bold so you can get a sense of what was discussed. We'll talk a little bit about what happened in August of 2005 and how so many people were impacted, what we have done as a government, what we didn't do, and what we should be doing going forward. In this excerpt here, we see that, and you don't see the whole transcript here, but in just the small quotation, what we see is a policymaker here using past disasters and also highlighting the impact of the several number of states as a way to focus on death tolls, for example. And later in this passage, the speaker here talks about the different death tolls and death rates in several different states. And this kind of highlights what I call as preparedness being a normative process, but on a macro level. It's often needed to justify preparedness by using statistics and numbers and death rates in order for people to think about why we even need to prepare in advance. And this falls in line with a lot of literature in communication that states that preparedness is only often prioritized as after a disaster strikes. Sometimes it's just thought of as an afterthought, unfortunately. Now, it's also noteworthy that repeatedly disasters are intertangled or intertwined with other policy issues. So environmental justice, climate change, contaminated water, and issues of race and class are repeatedly mentioned in combination with disasters, and specifically disaster preparedness too. So it's hard to tell what policymakers prioritize because sometimes the issues at hand may include elements of preparedness, but we don't actually know necessarily where preparedness falls in terms of the level of importance. That's not to argue that other issues are simply not important, in my opinion, but that disasters are commonly found within other issues as a means to get those conversations initiated. Now, how do we instill a culture of preparedness? I say this lightly, but I think it's important. Policymakers repeatedly refer to lessons learned, and in the C-SPAN archives, when I look at the spreadsheet from what I got from the API, I can see so many sessions titled Hurricane Lessons Learned, or specific disaster name, Lessons Learned. And how many times do we have to continue to learn about the impact of disasters when we know the next one is just going to strike sometime soon? It's also about cultivating community preparedness and resilience. And we see policymakers continuing to move a little bit from preparedness as an individual-centered behavior into a community-level phenomena. And then making preparedness accessible for all. It may sound really easy to just simply gather water and a flashlight and batteries, but for a lot of people, these are really challenging pro-social behaviors to engage with. So how do we make sure preparedness is accessible? These are some of the common elements I saw across the transcripts that I looked at. So, first and foremost, of course, you're going to see policymakers say things like, we need better communication between stakeholders. I think as communication scholars, we say, that's a no-brainer. But for legislators and policymakers, they continue to want to put communication about disasters to the forefront, even though for us, that's second nature. So we see that it makes sense to invest in pre-disaster mitigation efforts. We cannot adequately communicate with the public or coordinate in an effective recovery if we do not have access to crucial information that the nonprofit and federal partners we invite him to assist have. Emergency managers must be included through national policy. So it's also about involving the right people in the conversation. Now, there have been initiatives within FEMA and other legislators to make sure preparedness, again, is no longer a one-person behavior, but a team effort. And I really like this quote here, and the former administrator of FEMA, Brock Long, really had this initiative to want to inspire preparedness on a community level. And I think it's inspiring in a lot of ways because the efforts from the individual to community can really transcend what people can do on their own if they consider the efficacy of their own community itself. Whatever they define as their community, it could be helpful in getting people to prepare on their own. So a broken record about every single year, but he's absolutely right that the best preparedness is the preparedness that's being taken by individuals, homeowners, business owners. If they have a plan, if they have ideas about how they will respond to warnings, and they're paying attention, then the collective effort goes a lot more smoothly. We see that community and collective efficacy is important here. Then finally, what do we do to instill a culture of preparedness? Well, we need people to recognize the training and skills that everyone can do. So we have to design approaches to get residents to be financially ready and to teach them tangible skills like CPR again, and to go back to the old civil defense days of being ready. We have to do more pre-disaster mitigation. And people often think of preparedness as something that is just easy to do or you just can walk out the door, but it's more complicated than that. And so I think this notion here that there needs to be more skills in place, not just gathering emergency supplies, which of course is an important health communication behavior, but also how we can instill preparedness in other ways, like developing a communication plan, locating important records, being able to have conversations about health and safety behaviors like CPR, for example. These are skills that we need to make sure are ready and accessible for all. So throughout these two research questions and the overall exploration of preparedness as defined by policymakers in the United States, we see it's really a mixed bag in terms of how it's singled out by policymakers overall. And I really couldn't fully answer research question 1 because that relationship is a little bit convoluted. I think there are really good examples of where preparedness is prioritized, but it's often not thought of as important until it is too late, or when it's meshed with other issues, which happens a lot in local and federal government. We also see that lessons learned may not be truly lessons learned if we continue to have conversations about how we learn from the past. We've learned from the past, but we need to do things now to get people to want to prepare. We have to be ready for the next disaster. It's only a matter of time until the next hurricane, the next earthquake, the next large tornado comes in and causes damage to several communities. So I'm hopeful this presentation inspires others to have conversations about preparedness, and I look forward to discussing more with you during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we'll kind of pause here, maybe do a Q&A with your paper, and then we'll move on to Professor Eddington's. But thank you so much, Dr. Robertson, for that really interesting presentation. I know I feel sufficiently guilted into my lack of preparedness, so you have inspired me at least to think a little bit more holistically how I can be prepared as well. But certainly I love that your research question is focused on priorities and what priorities look like in this discourse. I think that really reflects the idea that through discourse, that's something that creates reality and reflects reality. And so in order to move forward with creating better priorities, we need to start with a discourse to evaluate what those priorities are right now. So with that, I would love to open the floor up for questions. We have about 7 to 10 minutes for questions, and then we'll move on to our next speaker. Any questions from the floor?
Thank you for the presentation. So after Hurricane Ian, I remember Fox News and CNN getting in a fun headline battle, which they do. Fox News saying hurricanes are not on the rise, actually, and CNN saying hurricanes are on the rise, and it's all global warming. So I'm wondering, you mentioned climate change. In the discourse, did you notice any partisanship into how each party approaches the topic? Because it seems like if we're talking disaster relief, if we don't tie it to climate change, Republicans are probably more likely to get on board with it. But if we tie it to climate change, then maybe not. I'm wondering if that manifested in the discourse, especially in the last few years.
Okay, so I think, yes, to answer your question, partisanship really can play a role. But I'm going to provide a little bit of devil's advocate to that here, because I think when disasters strike communities, and communities of all types of political affiliations, all types of demographic and psychographic differences, I see more examples of people willing to have conversations about disasters as compared to climate change, which of course is politicized. But I think when disasters come through communities, people are willing to have conversations about what to do next. I don't think the conversations are always adequate, but I think removing party lines, we see that more rural communities experience severe impacts of disasters and then, of course, experience stronger aftermath and effects long term. And so I think we see policymakers in those communities really want to do something for their constituents, for their residents, and that's across all party lines.
Yeah, so I'm just curious how you feel floor proceedings influence preparedness at the policy level and also at the public level. So if these are happening in the House and the Senate, do you think that that is some sort of signal about how that policymaker is going to interact with FEMA, et cetera? Do you feel as though that's something along the lines of, maybe that's the only instance where this person has the opportunity to speak about preparedness? Sure. So then when they start trying to do things in their own state or district or whatnot, then it's indicative of bad things to come in terms of how they respond to it. So I'm curious how you feel those two things relate.
Well, to adequately answer the question, I don't know if I can, but here's how I could do that. So I'm thinking about going back to the API data, and what I could do to answer that question is see whether or not the impact of, let's say, the testimony from a certain individual led to some type of legislation being put in place. And I could even code for that quantitatively too. So, I think that question inspires me to think a little more about the data that I actually have and other ways to go about answering your question properly. I don't know if I have an answer, but I'd like to see whether or not an individual's role could lead to some kind of change. And I could code for that in the next round.
So this is kind of related to the first question too. So I know that both Democrats and Republicans, they'd kind of come together for these issues, but I wanted to know did you see any difference between career bureaucrats, policymakers that are generally nonpartisan, as opposed to partisan responses, or was it pretty uniform?
It was pretty uniform overall. I would say it was uniform for the most part. In the 560-ish transcripts that I read and coded through, it was pretty uniform throughout. And I think that just tells you that unfortunately disasters unite people. I hate to say that, but disasters could be a uniting force that brings people together.
I was really intrigued by your finding that a lot of the discussion related to disasters are anchored to kind of these, I wouldn't say exemplar, but these large-scale disasters that have really come to serve as examples, right, of what these disasters can look like. I've done some research on crisis framing in general related to terrorism, and you see the same type of anchoring to these big moments, right? In your sense of that trend, what do you make of that? Do you see that to be limiting in preparedness discourse, or something that is beneficial to preparedness discourse? Because not all disasters are going to be on that scale, but certainly could give us a framework for how to think about disasters.
That's a really great question. And I think one of the things that I'll do to answer that adequately is to talk about disaster experience a little bit. And how many of you in the room have been through what's defined as a hazard or disaster in your lifetime? Can anyone raise their hand? Okay, I see a good chunk of hands raised up. And I would say that the impact of disasters and how individuals respond really depends. One variable that the literature says is disaster experience. If you have lived through a disaster before, your behaviors are going to be very different than someone who hasn't. And we talk about major disasters like Katrina, Rita, Hurricane Harvey in 2017, Hurricane Sandy in 2012. And we think about these disasters as really being defining moments. But if you weren't necessarily individually impacted, you might perceive that disaster relatively different than someone who did have impact. And so I think disaster experience is really one of the key motivators to hopefully get people to preparedness. But recently we just experienced Hurricane or Tropical Storm Ian in the Mid-Atlantic region where I live right now. And it was projected to come at one point and really go straight through the Midlands of South Carolina. It didn't. We just got heavy rain and winds. But it was really interesting in that moment to watch how people responded. And people really gathered sandbags, flashlights. I went to Ace Hardware and I couldn't find any supplies. You would think I'd have some things like that at home, but I needed to refresh some of my supplies. And people were fully stocked. And then it's ironic, I watch the news and I see people going to the grocery store and buying things like wine and snacks for their preparedness stockpile. So I think disasters and their impacts and how people have responded in the past could really play a role in how they choose to evacuate, how they choose to engage in gathering supplies. Those are all important considerations.
Any final questions before we move on?
Dr. Robertson, where do you want to see this particular research go in the future?
That's a great question. Well, now I'm inspired to go back to my data and do some more coding based on one of the questions that was asked today. Hopefully I may have some time to do that based on the feedback. But I would really hopefully love for this work to be a catalyst for continuing to prioritize how preparedness is really seen as important. Again, like I've mentioned, preparedness is not often thought of as the most important thing in the disaster management life cycle. So if there's ways that my research can help do that, I look forward to doing that.
All right, thank you so much. Please help me thank our first speaker today.
Thank you.
My name is Dr. Sean Eddington. I'm an assistant professor in communication studies at the A.Q. Miller School of Media and Communication at Kansas State University. And I'm going to be talking to you today about the work that I've done looking at and examining Trump's presidential talk related to COVID-19. And what I'll say is that before I jump in, this work around COVID-19 has been one of the things that my recent work has really wrestled with, and how people are engaging, making sense of, and responding to the different disruptions that COVID-19 has caused throughout our world. And so, thinking specifically about the C-SPAN archives, I was interested particularly in the leadership communication. And so as COVID-19 spread throughout the globe, society grappled with everyday life as the pandemic triggered what was a cascade of disruptions throughout work, home, and community. And a growing body of leadership scholarship has begun to examine the impact of leadership communication processes during the pandemic, referencing the 2020 issue of Leadership, the journal Leadership. In this special issue, they cite limitations of traditional theories in helping to understand and contextualize the crisis, as well as the COVID process and the COVID experience has surfaced new questions that impact everything from decision-making, ideological discourses, the gendered practices, as well as even what it means to do, perform, and to enact leadership. What we know, though, is in times of crisis, leaders often utilize a variety of different crafted narratives that help their followers make sense of the world around them. The emergence and uncertainty caused by COVID-19 stressed various social, economic, and political institutions, and while political leaders attempted to craft their messages on a host of different pandemic responses, the present study analyzes the messaging from the former US President Donald Trump around COVID-19. I build upon a variety of different questions around the study of resilience and leadership communication by exploring how resilience plays out in presidential narratives. I argue that by utilizing resilience scholarship, it's an important approach to understanding how Trump's talk, particularly early on in the pandemic, contributed to hopefully an enactment of resilience during the early disruptions and transitions of the pandemic. Resilience as a communicative process, so rooted in communication, is organized and enacted through discourse, messages, as well as even the narratives that people tell that help individuals, groups, and communities, as well as societies, adapt and transform following a crisis. Of particular interest for my study was the exploration of resilience in disaster context, and there have been growing calls to explore how resilience can be constituted in potentially more realistic, negative, or even tragic ways. That's to say that we move resilience beyond the origins of this positive framing and adaptations, moving from kind of the Pollyanna-ish ways that oftentimes resilience can be seen as this positive thing that people need to do. I draw specifically on Okamoto's conceptualization of resilience as particularly apt for this study. By expanding resilience theorizing towards a more realistic, potentially tragic end, how leaders frame and share narratives surrounding the pandemic offers insights into a better understanding of how resilience can be constituted through ongoing crisis that we're still in. Trump's response to the pandemic also can showcase how the use of narrative resilience is leveraged in a time of crisis. And I argue that he oftentimes leverages how leaders utilize this concept called restorative narratives. So in my study, I weave together resilience with the discoursive renewal theory from crisis communication and bring in this emerging theory from the field of journalism, which is called the restorative narrative, to study how Trump's presidential talk impacted, cultivated, constituted resilience. One of the early theorists of restorative narratives, Tenor, argues that these types of narratives don't necessarily downplay negative experiences in favor of false hope, as well as even convey human-centered experiences in favor through the images and stories shared. And so restorative narratives potentially offer a valuable genre of resilience in that they're frequently used to provide examples of recovery and resilience to broader, larger audiences. So in contrast to other forms of renewal and recovery narratives, restorative narratives also allow storytelling to potentially be tragic, critical, and maybe even liberatory. So in considering the different ways that COVID-19 surfaced inequities and disruptions throughout society, I argue that examining how Trump's use of restorative narratives can shed light on how he leveraged storytelling through his talk to cultivate narrative resilience through the coronavirus task force briefings. So in response to the growing fears of the COVID-19 pandemic, the White House Coronavirus Task Force was created early in 2020, in January 29th, to monitor, contain, and mitigate the spread of the virus while ensuring that the American people have the most accurate and up-to-date health and travel information. Trump initially appointed U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services Alex Azar to chair the task force. And on January 31st, 2020, he had issued a public health emergency regarding COVID-19, which resulted in different types of travel and re-entry restrictions, especially from individuals coming from China. Throughout early 2020, the task force itself was charged with containing the spread of the coronavirus. And as COVID-19 continued to spread globally, the task force worked with various governmental programs to prevent the spread of the virus nationally. However, in February, there were growing concerns with Azar's containment response, and so Trump replaced Azar in late February 20 with Mike Pence, vice president at the time. On March 16th, 2020, the White House Task Force aired its first briefing in a way to begin communicating its response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which Trump continually framed as this invisible enemy, this brilliant enemy. Trump and the task force held briefings daily, and the frequency of their daily briefings in late April 2020 started to reduce. So they started to become much more erratic. And basically the cause for this was there were concerns that his briefings were doing political damage to his 2020 re-election bid. So the basic question that my study looks at is how did Trump enact resilience in his coronavirus task briefings? To do so, I used the C-SPAN API and conducted a keyword search using Trump and coronavirus and COVID-19 to identify different instances where Trump talked about COVID-19. The initial search produced 197 transcripts. Each transcript was about 30 to 40 pages long. And so thinking about that and thinking about the scope of the data, I narrowed it down, focused specifically on the early White House task briefings. And so I gave attention to the transcripts of the task force briefings led by Trump from February 26th to April 27th, and it resulted in 43 different transcripts, right around specifically looking at Trump's comments, right around 160 pages of text that I was examining. And so the final text corpus consisted of 160 pages of text and nearly 68,000 words. So in order to study and look at this large volume of what Trump was talking about, I utilized a threefold process of text mining, semantic network analysis, and constant comparative method. So text mining is a useful tool, useful way that we can look at big data sets and try to identify high frequency words. One of the assumptions is that frequency determines how prevalent or how important certain types of concepts are. And so in order to understand how those concepts were related to one another, I engaged in the second step, which is a semantic network analysis. Similar to social network analysis, semantic network analysis allows researchers to visually map the connections beyond different concepts, topics, and conversations that exist in the text data. And then after I conducted those visualizations, I ran several different graph metrics to looking at how frequently connected certain concepts and nodes were. And then I finally did a constant comparative method as a way to understand in situ the different ways that Trump was leveraging and talking through resilience in his briefings. And so I'll talk a little bit about how to read what we're looking at in just a few moments. So as the analysis progressed, this third step of the analysis, I identified essentially 3 themes in the data that coalesced around a tension that I saw in Trump's framing of the pandemic. Putnam and colleagues define tensions as these feeling states, ones that often result from frustrations, blockages, or even uncertainty and paralysis as individuals face in dealing with contradictions and paradoxes. So given the focus on narrative resilience, I examined the specific 3 themes and the broader tension for how this talk served to both order and disorder the enactment of resilience in his COVID-19 talk. So I identified the theme of Trump consistently overplayed the impact of the pandemic, but at the same time downplayed it in a variety of different ways. And what came across in the data was the ways that the economic narratives and stories became much more important and much more prevalent than his ability to talk about the everyday human experience and the human cost of what the pandemic was doing. And so I'll showcase how those different tensions played out in the next couple of slides. So to illustrate this inversion, the first theme that I bring up is that Trump often discussed the American people within the context of the broader US economy. And you might look at this network and you might see the different ways that people is a central node. It's the biggest node that you see in this visualization here. And you might think, oh, Trump is talking a lot about American people. But the data actually point to the fact that he's talking about people, but in service of the broader economic narratives. And so he inverts this experience or this expectation that he's going to be more people-centric. And so I focus on this node pair, people dying, as a way to showcase how he's talking about the death and the destruction caused by COVID-19. So in an excerpt, one of the things that he talks about is this lamenting of Americans' economic progress that was essentially stymied because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in doing so, he references the 1918 Spanish flu. And he says, for weeks ago, we had the greatest economy in the history of the world. We had the most jobs ever in the history of the United States, almost 160 jobs, right? And then one day, I get a call from Dr. Fauci, and he said, we have a problem. And I said, what's the problem? And they said, we may have to close it up. They said, close up the country. And we discussed today, and probably not since 1917, came to the conclusion to shut down the economy. But in 1917, they didn't have that option. They just noticed that people were dying all over the place. And a lot of people in the country died. And I say, you know what that does to the fabric of this country? To people with great jobs, great families, no problems with money. Everything is perfect. And they have to go from that to having no job. And so here, Trump relies on this American dream rhetoric as a way to demonstrate his belief that the pandemic really harmed American workers, but at the end of the day, it was about the American economy that was being hurt by the pandemic. And so the impact of life here is comparable and coincides with the economic impact of job loss. The second theme organized around this tension is this notion that he was framing his governmental and political connections in service of the broader economy. So in characterizing the second thread of Trump's COVID communication, I give attention specifically to how he characterized the impact on businesses, particularly big business. And so I highlight how he leveraged communication with specific industries, as well as even political actors tied to these industries. He promoted this economic optimism in his work, and this is seen in the largest node being GREAT, where he talks about the great work that he's done. He also talks about the great conversations he's had with political leaders, the governors. He cites specifically in his talk folks like Gavin Newsom, the Democratic governor from California, Gretchen Whitmer, the Democratic governor from Michigan, although he never cites Whitmer's name in person, he just talks about the governor from Michigan. And even international leaders, talking about Putin, the president of Mexico, and other folks. And he talks about these as a way to both downplay the impact of the pandemic on the United States economy, talking about, oh, we're great, we've got great supplies, great surplus, but at the same time, we can't give up any of our resources because we've got to be strong, but we'll do our best. And he talks specifically about the oil industry in this section here, and specifically about the ways that he's working with oil companies as a means to solve the growing oil crisis. The third theme is a discussion of relief efforts to bolster small businesses. And so the central node, tremendous here, frames Trump's efforts as monumental, unprecedented in the fight against COVID-19. His rhetoric, again, is aspirational, focused on American potential. But in examining the node pair's tremendous progress and tremendous stimulus, he describes the potential for the stimulus impact to catalyze American economic growth. He says things like, we have a lot of exciting things taking place, we have tremendous plans, tremendous stimulus, we think we have a chance to do really well. Almost every node connected to the term tremendous demonstrates essentially this optimism, this forward-looking, prospective approach, as well as even gratitude for the American pandemic relief efforts. And in the node pair tremendous light, Trump's administration and his admiration for the American people is pronounced as he talks about these relief efforts having this tremendous light at the end of the tunnel. But again, it's always downplaying the lived experiences of people in service of the American economy that's not so bad, right? We'll get back to it. We'll bounce back to it after 15 days of closing. So in putting these all together, his adoption of economic rhetoric, as well as these narratives, were attempts to ensure the soundness of the American institutions that were vital in his construction, as well as how he enacted narrative resilience, while constantly downplaying the human cost of the pandemic. So in addition to the introduction, as Okamoto talks about, the introduction of tragedy and resilience, I argue that the findings showcase the role of this tensional communication in the enactment of narrative resilience, and I showcase how Trump's use of tensional communication framed his leadership can also constitute a form of narrative resilience that's organized through order and disorder dynamics. This idea that he's trying to order a message, but simultaneously disordering and creating different meanings for what's actually going on. So in other words, taking this approach, we can identify the different ways that irrationalities are embedded within Trump's tensional communication and may constitute a host of meanings and interpretations that enact resilience. As Trump is the consummate showman, what he's doing in his promotion and talking very optimistically about the work is counterbalanced with the lived realities, what's actually happening. And critics of the administration, journalists of the administration cite specifically the use of cherry picking certain findings, talking specifically about how this one study by Johns Hopkins talked about the preparedness of different nations and the United States being number one. But one of the main lines from this study was that no country is adequately prepared to actually respond to the pandemic. And so there's this inversion of reality, inversion of conversations about how and what we're doing that play out in what organizational scholars write is that this normalization of irrationality. And so these alternative logics that he uses are leveraged to order and disorder, and then we see these inversions of this discourse of renewal here. And so I write and argue that these resilience processes that he's organizing can be constructed not only through, as Okamoto argues, reality, but I also say this necessary fictions of what and how he's talking about the world around him. Future directions for this, looking specifically beyond the scope of these early 2 months. I'd like to see, again, as the summer of 2020 raged on, all these different competing interests. You saw this move away from messaging, consistent messaging in ways that that were a little bit problematic for a variety of different folks. And so looking at how his message devolved is of particular interest in the future, as well as my early idea, aspiration for this study was to compare and contrast both Trump and Biden. And so I think future studies could look specifically at how Biden, his talk about the economy and how his talk about COVID-19 played out. And then even interested in looking at the media reaction, as well as even how they're framing what he's talked about. Because there was a stark contrast between how Trump presented the economic reality and what the media was portraying and saying about this is what's actually happening in the world around us. So with that, I'll open up for questions, and thank you for the time today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eddington. That was just a really unique way of bringing together multiple fields, journalism, leadership, crisis communication. So that was a really interesting presentation, and I thank you for that. We have about 5 to 7 minutes for questions, so I will just open the floor right now for questions for Dr. Eddington.
What was the node with Bernie Sanders off to the right?
He was talking about Bernie's voters and how they were economically similar to him. And I think one of the things that I found in the data was that oftentimes if you see these little loops, these self-loops, Trump's talk is unique in that it often repeats itself. And so he'll say great things, right? And so there's this kind of reiteration of the things that he's talked about. But I think the Bernie Sanders nodes, I looked at that interestingly, and he was talking about the economic plight and economic issues that they identified in the 2016 election, and I think he was talking specifically about how he'd like to bring those voters in as part of his coalition for 2020.
So kind of going on the repetition of Trump terms, like if you listen to the news media, they said things like build the wall was his kind of code word for immigration. And I noticed in your little networks there was a lot of use of great. So how did that compare to, I don't know how much you looked at kind of his other rhetoric? Is he usually uplifting, or does he have negative ones that he goes back to? And just wondering how it compares.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And there are ways that, from a methodological standpoint, you could do sentiment analysis to look at the emotional capacity of his talk. I believe in the context of the framings, and this coincides with some of the work that's done on discourse of renewal. There was an attempt to be optimistic. There was an attempt to be an ethical communication and being forward-looking, right? We're going to get through this. However, I think with Trump in that space, it was a much more reined-in context for him to be communicating, and there wasn't as much deviation. And even I included in the network some of the conversations that he had specifically with reporters. There wasn't much deviation between the messaging. And so it was fairly optimistic, fairly focused on trying to convey his message that we're doing okay, but it doesn't really impact our business. We're being ravaged in all these different sectors, but I'm working on it. I will solve this, things like that. So he was, some of the critics, some of the writers from Washington Post, Politico, talked about it as like his self-aggrandizement, where he's touting the success and creating this fantasy of we've got it handled.
We have time for one more question. Well, Dr. Eddington, I'll ask one. I'm really interested in thinking about discourse of renewal in the political context, right? Because, in the crisis communication literature, it's, a way to move forward, but also recognizing that there's room for growth. But in the political context, right, what we know about campaign rhetoric, especially from incumbents, is that you need to promote your accomplishments, and you don't want to focus on crisis communication. So what limitations do you see there being for politicians who want to enact narrative resilience while also trying to focus on effectively campaigning?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think that's one of the pieces that I attempted to bring out in the paper is that one of the areas that Trump talked specifically about, and one of his largest successes politically, was his economic agenda. And then you have the COVID-19 pandemic that basically blew that up. And so I think that there were different ways that if you were a politician working towards re-election, I think what folks were yearning for was not just everything is fine, but here's the reality of what we're facing. And what we know from organizational, economic, workplace literature is that specifically the pandemic caused a whole host of different types of impacts. And I think even attending to, referencing, bringing up, and recognizing the human impact of COVID-19 could have done wonders to acknowledge, yes, we were doing great. These things happen, but I think it goes back to some of the things that Dr. Robertson was talking about, is this idea of preparedness and working through crisis, and how do we leverage all these different networks to showcase not only strength, but the ability to respond in the face of this largely wicked problem that had wide-ranging impact, that there wasn't one single bullet, silver bullet response to what could have done and what could have solved things.
Dr. Robertson, Dr. Eddington, thank you very much. Please help me thank our speakers once again.